All right, with Hashem's help, we're going to learn today Yevamos Daf Lamed Beis. We left off Yevamos Daf Lamed Beis 4 lines from the top, Amar Rava, and let us start with a quick recap of the case that we are learning. The Mishnah in Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis spoke about 3 brothers that married 3 wives that were unrelated to each other. Reuven, the first brother, died. His brother Shimon did Maimar with his widow, and then Shimon died. So the Tanakam in the Mishnah said, the way the Gemara explained it, that being that Maimar, according to the Tanakam, is like a Miktsas Kedushin. In other words, Shimon's widow, the widow that used to be Reuven's widow, is, so to say, a double widow. Midah Eiraisa, the Maimar that Shimon did, is not valid. So therefore she's Reuven's widow. However, Midah Rabbanan, since Shimon did Maimar, she's also Shimon's widow. The Chachamim, based on an Asmachta, made a takana that Chalitza needs to be done with both. Sai on the double widow, and also on Shimon's original wife. To which the Gemara asked, why did the Chachamim have to make such a takana? Why did they do that? And the Gemara answered, because an observer might have thought that both of these widows are Shimon's wives, Midah Eiraisa, and Midah Eiraisa, the mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza only needs to be done with one of the widows. You have to build the bias of your brother, but a person is not allowed to do Yibum with both. So therefore the Chachamim did not allow Levi to do Yibum with either of them. And the Gemara asked, well, they should have said Yibum with one and Chalitza with the other. So the Gemara answered that if this would have been the order, then you're right, that would have worked. But the Chachamim were afraid that Levi might do first Chalitza with one, and then he'll do Yibum with the other. And we learned together that once Chalitza is performed to the widow, not this man who did Chalitza, nor any of the brothers are ever allowed to marry her again. And again, being that people will think that both of these widows are Shimon's widows, if they will witness Shimon doing Chalitza to one and then Yibum to the other, they might apply that to other cases, where Shimon Taka had 2 full-fledged wives, 2 full-fledged widows, and one brother might do Chalitza with one and Yibum with the other, and that's Asar Midah Eiraisa. So based on all of the above, Amar Rava, that if Nasan get l'mamarai, that if Shimon, who did Maimar with Reuven's widow, then gave her a get and specified, I'm giving you a get only for the Maimar. What does that mean? He specified the get only for the Maimar. There's another rabbinic law that we mentioned before, that if a brother, who instead of doing Yibum or Chalitza decides to give a get, and really this is true whether he gave Maimar or not, the Chachamim said once you gave a get, you can't do Yibum anymore. Because get to an observer appears like a Chalitza, and we have this din that Kivin Shaliban Shuv La Yivna. Once Chalitza is done, you're not allowed to do Yibum. So Midrabanan, if a Yavam gave a get, which Midah Eiraisa, the get has no significance. Nevertheless, Midrabanan, he can't do Yibum anymore. Having said that, there is a unique case where the Yavam gives a Maimar, and after he gives a Maimar, he decides he doesn't want to be connected to her, and he gives her a get, and he specifies the get that I am giving to you is not a get for the Zika. I'm giving you a get only to take away that which I accomplished through the Maimar. So in such a case, says Rava, even though according to the first Girsa, she herself will never be allowed to be taken to Yibum, but Chutrat Sarasa, the co-wife, will be permissible to Levi. In other words, what happened was Reuven died, Shimon married Reuven's widow. Shimon did Maimar to Reuven's widow. After he did Maimar, Shimon gave her her get, and he said the get is only for the Maimar, and now Shimon dies. So here Rava says, Levi can marry Shimon's original wife. Makes a lot of sense. Based on what we said before, why did the Chachamim make a gzeira that you should not be allowed to do yibum with either of them? Because an observer might think that if a man dies and leaves two widows, you can give chalitza to one and do yibum with the other, and you're not allowed to do that. Over here, no one will think that. Because by the fact that Shimon gave one a get, it's clear that she's not Shimon's wife. No one will confuse it in the case where a man leaves two widows. Nevertheless, says the Gemara, according to this first version, Aval he, but this woman, in other words, Reuven's original widow, the woman to whom Shimon gave Maimer and then a get, only Lemamorai, she remains Asr. Why? Because the Mechalfa bebalas get, people might think that when a man gives a get to a Yevama, we just said that there's a takanas chachamim, that after he gives her a get, he should never do yibum with her, even though here the get was only given for the mimer. Nevertheless, one person might confuse it with a normal get, and where there is this general rabbinic law that after a Yavam gives a get to a Yevama, he's not allowed to do yibum with her, so here also he cannot do yibum. That is the first version. The Amri, other people held that Rava was even more lenient. That Amar Rava, Nasan get l'mamarai. That if Shimon gives a get, that if Shimon is going to give a get to Reuven's widow to whom he gave Maimer, and he said, this get is only for the Maimer, not only can Levi marry Shimon's original wife, but Rutra afilohi, even she could be taken to Yibum by Levi, Maitama, because Maida Avid Ba Shakle. Because really, if Reuven would have died, and then Shimon would have died, Levi would have a mitzvah, and he would be allowed to do Yibum with both of these widows. They're coming from two different houses, from two different batim. Why is this case different? Because Shimon gave Maimer to Reuven's widow. Well, if he gave her Maimer, and then he gave her a get, and he said the get is to take away the Maimer, so whatever he did, he undid. So she goes back to being just Reuven's widow. So therefore, according to the Ikeda Amri, Rava would hold that Levi can do Yibum with both of these Yevamos. Moving on to the next Mishnah. All right. Next Mishnah is a simple case. However, we are opening a very famous sugya, the sugya of Ein Isur Chal Al Isur, as we'll explain in a moment. But let us begin with a case that we're familiar with. Simple. There were two brothers that were married to two sisters. So just to be consistent with the names, Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Leah, Umeis Echad Mihem, let's say Reuven dies. Simple case where you don't have the mitzvah of Yibum because the widow is an erva. The erva here is called Achois Ishtoi. The widow is Shimon's wife's sister. So he did nothing to her, right? No Yibum, no Chalitza. But before she married anyone else, Leah dies. V'achar kach meisa Ishtoi shel sheni. Leah, Shimon's wife, dies. The reason why Shimon was exempt of doing Yibum with Reuven's widow was because of the erva of Achois Ishtoi. And the erva of Achois Ishtoi is only an erva as long as one's wife is alive. If a person's wife passes away, then the husband can marry his wife's sister or any one of her sisters because she's no longer living. So one might have thought that now that Leah died, perhaps Shimon should be allowed to do Yibum or should be obligated to do Chalitza at least with Rachel. Says the Mishnah, Harei Zu Asura Olav Elamis. Says the Mishnah that Rachel is always Asur on Reuven. Why? Hoyil v'nesra olav sha'achas. Since during the moment of death, right? Especially if we're going to learn Misa Mapelas. Rachel was Asur on Shimon because of the erva of Achais Ishtoi. Once that prohibition went into effect, let's word it the way the Rishonim word it, so then the original Isur of Eishes Ach stands. Just like if Reuven would have had children with Rachel, and Shimon would have been married to Miriam, to another woman, not related to Rachel's wife. But if Reuven has children and Reuven dies, Shimon is never allowed to marry his brother's wife, even though his brother died, because that's called the erva of Eishes Ach. Eloma, Eishes Ach is taken away when there is the mitzvah of Yibum. But when we don't have the mitzvah of Yibum, in our case, because during death, Rachel is Achois Ishtoi, So now the original Eishes Ach stays. And therefore, even though Leah died, Shimon is never allowed to marry Rachel because she's the erva of Eishes Ach. Ask the Gemara, obvious question, Pshita. Why Pshita? If you remember in Daf Lamed, we had the 4 cases. So let us speak by heart the third case, the third Mishnah. The third Mishnah was also, there was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Rachel's sister Leah, and Levi married Miriam. And the case there was that first Reuven died. When Reuven dies, his widow Rachel doesn't fall to Shimon, because Shimon is married to Rachel's sister. But there was a Levi there. So the Mishnah gave a case that Levi did Yibum to Rachel. After Levi did Yibum to Rachel, the Mishnah there said, Leah dies. And after Leah dies, Levi dies. So again, one would have thought that when Levi dies, he left 2 wives, his original wife, Miriam, and her co-wife, which used to be the erva on Shimon because of Achais Ishtoi, but is no longer. There also the Mishnah said that no Yibum or Chalitza is going to be performed, because Rachel continues to be an erva on Shimon, and therefore she and her tzara are pater for Yibum and Chalitza. So first of all, there we already see the concept that Hoyel v'nesra olav sha'achas, she always remains asr. And not only is it similar, but the Gemara is going to say a better question, that it's actually a kal v'chomer, that the case over there is even a greater chiddush than the case over here. And if in the third Mishnah Daf Lamed, we learned the din that Hoyel v'nesra olav sha'achas, she always remains prohibited on Shimon, then over here for sure she should be prohibited. So not only is it extra, it's not a kal v'chomer, we know it automatically. Why is it a kal v'chomer? Let's read it inside. Hashta, and now, Uma Hasam. Over there in the case in Daf Lamed, the third Mishnah, that when Reuven dies and Rachel becomes a widow, the case there wasn't that there was only one brother, like we have over here. There was Shimon and Levi. And Levi was allowed to do Yibum, which he did, or he would have to do Chalitza. In other words, the Rachel still has a zika to the family. She's still connected to the family. So one would have argued that since when Reuven died, Rachel was still connected to the family, so now when Leah dies, that connection should go to Shimon. And even there we don't say that. We don't say there's a connection to the family. We say to Shimon, during Reuven's death, she was an erva of Achais Ishtoi. She's asr to him, she stays asr to him. For sure over here, when Reuven died in Daf Lamed Beis, he only had one brother. And when Reuven died, at that moment, the brother, the only brother, was not allowed to do Yibum, was exempt from Chalitza, because then Leah was still living. So now she became mutter to the whole world. So therefore, sure, we're not going to say that her heter l'shuk becomes somehow nullified and she's bound again to Shimon. The zika was taken off. Over there, Deloy Mitcha Mahai Beisa Lagamri, over Daf Lamed.
So the pshita is based on what we already done.
That's right, and the Hakal V'chaimer. That over there, that when Reuven dies, there's still a zika. There is a zika. Elama, not the Shimon. And we say, Omar, we say, Loi, that Shimon never will be allowed to marry her even after Leah dies. Haki over here, only 2 brothers. And when Reuven died, at that moment, there is no zika to the family. Because Shimon is married to Rachel's sister, to come mitcha mahai beisa lagamri. So like Kolchkin, for sure, we should have known automatically that Shimon can never marry her, because Nesra olav sha'achas. So the Gemara gives an answer that we had a page and a half ago. And the answer is like this. That Tana ha Tana Bereisha. That originally, Rebbe, or the other Tanoim who he's compiling, actually held that in Daf Lamed Beis, Shimon will, that in Daf Lamed Beis over here, this is the only case where Shimon cannot marry Rachel. Because when Reuven passed away, there was only one brother that was not allowed to marry her. So now she has no connection to the family. Here, there's no mitzvah of Yibum even after Leah dies. But originally the Tana held that in the case, and Daf Lamed in the third Mishnah, since she has a connection to the family, Levi did Yibum, then Leah dies, then Levi dies. Originally we would have held that Shimon is allowed to do Yibum. Shimon needs to do Yibum or Chalitza to Levi's wives, to one of them, including to Rachel. But and and he left it out. In other words, originally the Mishnah Daf Lamed was not inserted. And then the Tana changed their mind. And the Tana felt that even in the case in Daf Lamed, even there, Rachel remains aser to Shimon. Now, being that this was a novelty, it was something that it was a chiddush, so va'ayda the chaviv alei. Since now this din became a beloved din, agdema. He wrote it nach first. And of course, once we have the Mishnah and Daf Lamed, this Mishnah is obvious. But this Mishnah always was learned. In conclusion, in both cases, we have this din that hoyel v'nesra olav sha'achas, that isser during the moment of the passing stays, or as the Rishonim worded, it does not allow the isser of Eishes Ach to fall to the side. Rachel always remains one's brother's wife, Shimon's brother's wife, and he's never allowed to take her into Yibum. Okay, so now let's start. Tana Rabbanan. This is going to be a very important sugya for the whole Shas regarding Isur, Chal al Isur, or Ein Isur, Chal al Isur. Tana Rabbanan. Case of the Mishnah. Reuven and Shimon. There are two brothers. Both of these brothers marry two sisters. Reuven marries Rachel, Shimon marries Leah. Reuven passes away. We learned in our Mishnah that in our case, even if, but before the even if, Reuven passes away, what is Rachel to Shimon? She's usher because of, she's Shimon's wife's sister, before Leah passes away. And she's also one's brother's wife. One's brother's wife where there isn't a mitzvah of Yibum. So what were to happen? What happens if Shimon has a relation with Rachel? How many Isurim were violated? So says Rabbi Yosi, Chayiv Aleha Mishum Eishes Ach, Mishum Achais Isha Divrei Rabbi Yosi. That the person violated indeed two erva prohibitions. These are erva prohibitions for which there is no capital punishment, but for which there is kares. And just to remind ourselves the rule that we learned together, that whenever a person violates a lav b'shoigeg, and that negative commandment, if one would have done it on purpose, b'mezid, one would get, God forbid, kares. So when one does it b'shoigeg, for that you have to bring a korban chatos. So let's give an example that he had this relation b'shoigeg. How many karbanos, how many chata'os do they have to bring? So Rabbi Yosi is saying two. What's the two? Eishes Ach, Achais Isha. Comes along Rabbi Shimon and he argues with Rabbi Yosi, Ein Chayev Ela Mishum Eishes Ach Bilvad.
He thought that he was allowed to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
In other words, he knew what he was doing, but he didn't know it's prohibited. That could be an example of shogeg. And Rabbi Shimon says he's only chayev for the lav of one's brother's wife. Eishes Ach. The Gemara adds, but there was another braiser where Rabbi Shimon said the same din, but from another lav. We learned in another place, Rabbi Shimon Oimed Ein Chayev Ela Mishum Achais Isha Bilvad. He's chayev one chatas because of the sin of your wife's sister. So the Gemara says, Loi Kashem. Rabbi Shimon actually is saying the same exact thing. And the din of Rabbi Shimon, and seemingly Rabbi Yosi, is contingent on this debate if Isur Chal al Isur, or if Ein Isur Chal al Isur. What does that mean in English when something is already prohibited and then something else comes up? So there is a logic to say that since anyways Hashem said this is prohibited, nothing else is added to it. There's no need for it. It's ushered anyway. Rab Shimon holds Ein Isur Chal al Isur. That's the way we'll understand it initially. And therefore there's only one Isur here. The only question is what happened first. So we're going to use the words of Nasa Chai, Nasa Meis. Nasa Meis, a dead person didn't marry. Nasa Meis means the one who eventually will die married first. Nasa Meis is Reuven. So let's think about it by heart. If Nasa Chai first, if Shimon married first, when Shimon married Leah, what was Rachel to Shimon? She was already prohibited because she is Achais Ishtay. So later Reuven marries Rachel, even though that in itself would have created an Isser of Eishes Ach, it's not Chal here. It doesn't go into effect here. She's anyways prohibited. Rachel prohibited on Shimon. That is where the Braisa, that's the Braisa that says that if Reuven dies and Shimon has a relation with her B'shoigig, he only brings one chatas from Achais Ishtoi. But if Nasa Meis, if Reuven, the one who was going to die, married Rachel first, means before Shimon married Leah, Rachel already cannot be with Shimon because Rachel is Eishes Ach. There, even after Shimon marries Leah, according to Rab Shimon, since she's already ushered because of Eishes Ach, the new lav of Achais Ishtoi won't be chal, it won't go into effect, and therefore it's one or the other inside. Kan shenasachai, when the one who remained alive, which is Shimon, married first, and then Nasa Meis, then the one that eventually will die, married Rachel. In that case, the lav is the lav of Achais Ishtoi. Kan, the Braisa that says the lav is from Eishes Ach, is Shenasa Meis. Reuven was the one who married Rachel first, and right away, Rachel and Shimon cannot be together because of Eishes Ach, and then Nasachai, and therefore, Ein Isur Chalal Isur. And what about Rabbi Yosi? Seemingly, Rabbi Yosi holds that Isur Chal Al Isur. Doesn't matter that Rachel was Asur because of one love. Now that something else came up, now she's Asur also because of another love. So Rabbi Yosi says Chayv Shtayim, Rabbi Shimon says Chayv Achaz. This will be the base of the next, almost two daf. Okay. So first of all, the Gemara asks what we call in Yiddish Aklotz Kacha, which is an amazing question, a genius question. According to Rabbi Shimon, who holds Ein Isur Chalal Isur, Rabbi Shimon Heichad Nasa Meis. If Reuven was the one who was going to die, while he was living, married Rachel, and then Nasachai, then Shimon marries Leah, and Rabbi Shimon is saying, Kivan the Isur Achais Isha Loichayil. According to Rabbi Shimon, the prohibition of Achais Ishtoi doesn't go into effect because she's already Asr because of Eishes Ach. Why did the Mishnah tell you that when Reuven dies, Shimon does not do Yibum? Why doesn't he do Yibum? One second, didn't Hashem say that the Isur of Eishes Ach doesn't stay in effect when a man dies without children? Reuven died without children. The only Isur is Eishes Ach. Let Shimon do Yibum with Rachel. A fantastic question. The answer is no, she's an erva. What's the erva? Achais Ishtoi. You just said that if you hold Ein Isur Chalal Isur, there is no Achais Isha.
Well, it's no, you don't get punished for it.
Well, you have to get the right wording for this. Oh, no, the Isur has to be here. So first of all, for this, the Gemara, Tisyabim Yabume, let Shimon do Yibum. So Rav Ashi clarifies the meaning of Ein Isur Chalal Isur. When we say that the new prohibition doesn't go into effect because anyways there is a prohibition, it doesn't mean it goes away. The wordings that we have in the Gemara will be the Isur is hanging in the air. The Isur is there. It's not Chal. It doesn't go into her, but it's right above her. Why are we saying it? We're saying that because if the original Isur were to go away, then this new prohibition would be Chal. So why can't you do Yibum? Can't do Yibum because Eishes Ach, so to say, is going away. Mitzvah Yibum. The moment Eishes Ach goes away, then Achais Isha goes into effect. When Achais Isha goes into effect, Achais Isha does not allow Shimon to have a relation with Rachel. Once Shimon cannot have a relation with Rachel, so now the Eishes Ach goes back as the only one. Let's read it inside. Amar Ravashi, Isar Achais Isha, Mitli, Toli, Vikoi. It's hanging on top of Rachel and on top of Shimon, prohibiting him to be with Rachel. It's there. And if the prohibition of Eishes Ach will go away, and you can argue it should go away. Reuven died without children. The moment that happens, then this new prohibition of you can't marry your wife's sister is going to take effect. And therefore, Leipaka, Eishes Ach doesn't go away. So therefore, Rab Shimon in one of the Braisa says that the Isur is Eishes Ach. But Yibum cannot happen. Because Achais Isha does not allow Yibum to happen. Okay. Ask the Gemara the following. How can you say, how it appears, that the argument between Rabbi Yosi and Rab Shimon regarding if Shimon had a relation b'shoigig with Rachel. Rabbi Shimon says he's only chayiv, let's say, one carbon chatus. Rabbi Yosi says he has to bring two. In other words, Rabbi Yosi holds Isur could be chal al Isur. Isur is chal al isur. As the Gemara, we learned in another Braisa, Rabbi Yosi, who said a din, and there it appears that Rabbi Yosi holds that ein isur chal al isur. There's going to be a stira between Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Yosi. V'hatanya. V'sava Rabbi Yosi isur chal al isur. V'hatanya, we learned the following. Avar aveda sheyesh bo shtei misos. The case over there is that, Rashi uses the example, is that a man had a relation with his mother-in-law who is also a married woman. The isur of eishes ish, of having a relation with a married woman, as well as the prohibition, the erva, of having a relation with one's mother-in-law, isn't only an erva that has karas. Here, these two happen to have capital punishment. But the capital punishment of each one is different than the other. The punishment for having a relation with a married woman is to be killed by a beis din bechenek, through strangulation. And the isur, and the punishment of having a relation with one's mother-in-law, is sreifa, being burnt. Sreifa is considered a lot more stringent than strangulation. Now, if you remember, we learned already together online, the machlekes tanoim, whether skila or sreifa is the most serious of the four capital punishments meted out through the beis din. So we have a machlekes regarding skila and sreifa. But according to everyone, skila and sreifa, that category is more chamur, is more strict, is considered a worse death than both beheading, hereg, and chenek. Everyone agrees sreifa is a worse punishment than chenek. So the Braisa says, if a man has a relation with one's mother-in-law who's also married, Tanakama says, nidoin b'chamura. The Tanakama says that in Taka there's two violations here. But being that the punishment for this violation is not makis you can give twice. Carbon, you can bring two karbanis. But when it comes to the punishment of being put to death, technically you can't kill a person twice. So the Tanakama says the rule is you have to punish the person with the more serious punishment. Don't forget that the whole concept of punishment is to bring atonement, is kapara. And therefore we want for this person to achieve the full kapara. So you have to give the person the stricter, because the person also violated the sin which demands sreifa, burning. So you have to burn the person. Just also, parenthetically, the burning wasn't that they burned the outside of the body. The sreifa happened by beis din manipulating the sinner's mouth open, and they used to pour down his throat boiled lead or another type of iron, and the inwards of the person got burnt. Okay, comes along Rabbi Yosi, and Rabbi Yosi tells the Tanakama, here's a chayin, eini so halal isur. You want to know which punishment to give the man who had a relation with his mother-in-law? You have to see which of the only crime that he committed. And there's only one sin being committed here. Nidin bezika harishayna haba olav. You have to see what isur came first. In other words, if when the man married his wife, his mother-in-law was married, so before he married her daughter, he was already not allowed to be with her because she's a married woman. True, he married her daughter, so now she's also asur because of chamoisa, but Rabbi Yosi holds ein isur halal isur. So really the only isur that he violated was having a relation with a married woman. For that, the punishment is chenek. If when he married his wife, his mother-in-law was single, she was a widow, she was divorced, but she was not married. So first of all, the moment a man gets married, if his mother-in-law is single, he cannot be with her because of chamaisa. And even if later she got married, ein isur halal isur, the isur of eishes ish vis-a-vis the son-in-law does not apply. So therefore he only violated the sin for which you chayiv sreifa. So it's not that you have to choose the chamura. See which isur came first. And Vitanya Keitzad Amar Rabbi Yosi, and we learned in the Braisa Nach Rabbi Yosi explaining. He talked it out. What's the meaning of nidin beziko d'sheina ba'olav? If when he married his wife, his mother-in-law was a single woman, which means the isur of mother-in-law was chal first, and then Vinas is Eishes Ish, and then after he married her daughter, the mother-in-law gets married, and then this man had a relation with her b'mezid, then nidin b'chamaisai. Then he gets killed by sreifa, because that's the only isur that exists here. However, if Eishes Ish, If she was married, and before the man married her daughter, she's a married woman, he cannot be with her because of Eishes Ish. And then Venasas Chamoisai, then Nidin Be'Eishes Ish, then only Chenek happened. In other words, seemingly in this Braisa, Rabbi Yossi holds that Ein Isur Chalal Isur. So how do you reconcile the original Braisa that spoke about Reuven, Shimon, Rachel and Leah? Right? Reuven dying and Shimon, not Reuven dying. Shimon having a relation with Rachel. That Rabbi Yossi says he's chayiv both because of Eishes Ach. Yeah, Reuven died. Eishes Ach, and because of the Isur of Achais Ishtoi, does he or does he not hold of Isur Halal Isur? That's the question. Turning the page. So Amar Rabbi Abbohu. So guys, halt up. Rabbi Abbohu is going to say that Rabbi Yossi generally holds Ein Isur Chal Al Isur, which explains the latter Braisa, the mother-in-law Eishes Ish, that there's only one or the other. However, there are exceptions. And the case of Shimon having a relation with Reuven's wife Rachel, there you will be chayiv twice, because there's something called the Isur Moisav, which Rabbi Yossi holds of, while we're introducing the concept of whenever there is an Isur Moisav, then Isur is Halal Isur. Let's first say the words. There's something called Isur Moisav, there's something called Isur Koilol, and there's something called Isur that's Chal Bebas Achas together. Okay, let's go out of the order, but the last one that I mentioned is the easiest to explain. When does Rabbi Yossi hold that Ein Isur Halal Isur? When one comes before the other. Makes sense. Once, since this is already Asur, so even though God wasn't saying this is Asur again, He already told you can't do it. He's not addressing this scenario to you. It's Asur anyway. She's a married woman. Hashem is not telling you don't have a relation because she's your mother-in-law. It's not needed. You can't have a relation because she's a married woman. But whenever there's a scenario, and we'll give examples for that later, where both Yisurim come at the same time, then one can argue, then Isur is Chal together with the other Isur. Then there could be two Isurim. So that might be one exemption, and we'll get to the examples for that later. But let's speak about Isur Moisav and Isur Koilol. Isur Moisav means an extensive prohibition, and Isur Koilol means an inclusive prohibition. And we'll stick to the words in Hebrew. Moisav and Koilol, they're not the same. People many times quote that Rashi here in Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, the middle of the Amud, that's explaining the difference between Isur Moisav and Isur Koilol. So let's use the words of Rashi. Isur Moisav. Isur Moisav would mean the following, and the wordings that Rashi uses are words b'negeya to kosher or non-kosher foods. If there is a chaticha, if there is something, if there is a piece of meat that is already asur, but that piece of meat, let's say, is only asur on you, and because of a new isur, the same piece of meat that is already prohibited, now because of the other isur, will become asur on someone else. So here Rabbi Yossi says, since the new Isur is being Chal for the someone else, so it would also be Chal for you as well. Isur Moisav would mean that whenever the thing is already prohibited, becomes prohibited to another person because of a new Torah violation, that new Torah violation will also apply to you, even though you were anyways Asur to have that Chatich. Isur Koilol means whenever there's a case, that which is prohibited is not becoming prohibited on more people. But there are other people that were permitted to you, they are becoming asur to you. Since they are becoming asur to you, then this chaticha also becomes asur to you. And let's give, for these examples, mamash our case. Okay? The first case of Isur Moisav is going to be where Shimon married first. Think about it. If Shimon marries Rachel, Shimon marries Leah, what is Rachel for Shimon? Rachel becomes a chaticha asura because of achais ishtay. Now, is Rachel prohibited, let's say, if there is another brother, Levi? Absolutely not. If Shimon marries Leah, Rachel and Shimon is asur achais ishtay. But Rachel is not asur to any one of Shimon's brothers, which is why Reuven can marry Rachel. Now that Reuven marries Rachel, which normally that would create the new Isur of Eishes Ach. Eishes Ach will go on Levi. The Chaticha that's Asr to Shimon because of Achais Ishtoi, true that she's Asr for Shimon anyway. But now that Reuven marries Rachel, now this same Rachel is Asr on Levi, on Yehuda, because of Eishes Ach. So now we say, since the Isur of Eishes Ach is Chal on the other brothers, it's also going to be Chal on Shimon. That's called Isur Koilel. I'm sorry, that's called Isur Moisev. Get the words clear. Moisev.
That would be the reason why he had.
That would be the reason why Rabbi Yossi would say Yechayiv to Chata'is, because if this would only work in this scenario.
Does that only apply if there actually are other brothers?
Probably. It has to be Chal on someone else.
Well, our case in the Mishnah only has one brother. It was only Reuben and Shimon. We didn't have Levi.
Mentioned.
Well, for sure not, because we asked the question of the one before that.
Correct, but then we said it's all the same thing. Then we said it's all the same thing. The bottom line. Okay, we're not going into this right now, but the concept of Isur Maisav is this case. Shimon marries Leah. That means Rachel. The question is, at the end, Shimon had a relation with Rachel. We're debating how many Lavan did Shimon do with Rachel. So Rachel is the issue here. When Shimon married Leah, the first Isur was Achais Ishtoi. Rachel is Asr. Normally, Ein Isur Chalal Isur. But now that Reuven married Rachel, Rachel now becomes Asr from this new prohibition of Eishes Ach and the other brothers, on Levi and Yehuda. So Isur Moisev means, since Rachel became Asr because of Eishes Ach on Levi, she'll also be Asr because of Eishes Ach on Shimon, even though Shimon anyways is Asr because of Achais Ishtoi. Isur Moisev. What is Isur Koilel? The other way around. Isur Koilel means that Reuven married first. When Reuven marries first, Rachel cannot be with whom? Cannot be with Shimon. Why not? Eishes Ach. Rachel cannot be with Levi. Rachel cannot be with Yehuda. Rachel is Asr. Good. When Shimon marries Leah, what was added? Whatever was Asr, who was Asr until now? Rachel. She doesn't become more Asr. She was Asr to him before, she's Asr to him now. She was Asr to the other brothers before, she's already Asr to the other brothers. However, here's where it's different. When Shimon marries Leah, let's say Leah has a sister called Bila. Before Shimon married Leah, who was Shimon Asr to have a relation with? Only with Rachel, because Rachel was his brother's wife, Eishes Ach. But Bila was mutter on Shimon. Now that another sister, the third sister.
So she's not her sister?
There's Rachel. Yes, she is. Let's go. When Reuven marries Rachel, who was Asr on Shimon? Only Rachel, because of Eishes Ach. Bila is mutter. Leah is mutter. He married Leah. Now Shimon marries Leah. It does not make the Chaticha Asur on other people. But there was another woman that was mutter on Shimon, which is Bila. Bila now becomes Asur on Shimon because of Achais Ishtoi. So Isur Koilel means, since Achais Ishtoi is being Chal on a Chaticha that was mutter, which is now becoming Asur, so let that also be Chal on Rachel. Rachel should also be called Achais Ishtoi. That's called Isur Koilel. In other words, there's a logic to say that Ein Isur Chalal Isur, but whenever there's an Isur Koilel, then Isur is Chalal Isur. Isur Maisav was the case where Shimon married first, and Isur Koilel is the case where the Reuven married first. The Gemara is taking it for granted that it must be that even if Rabbi Yossi holds that Isur Chal al Isur, when there is an Isur Maisav, Rabbi Yossi will not hold so by Isur Koilel. And I'll tell you soon in a moment why. So Rabbi Bo begins to answer, let's read it inside now, that might Rabbi Yossi be Isur Maisav, which is why Rabbi Yossi said in the Braisa that if Shimon has a relation with Rachel, he's Chayv Shtayim, because there's an Isur Maisav. So right away counters the Gemara against Rabbi Bohu. Tinach, that would work. Heichid Nasa Chai, where Shimon was the one that married Leah first. Rachel becomes prohibited on Shimon because of Achais Ishtoi, and then Nasa Meis, then Reuven marries Rachel. When Reuven marries Rachel, the same Chaticha Rachel that was Asur on Shimon, because of the marriage of Reuven, becomes Asur on the other brothers. So Migu di Itois of Isur Legaba Achim. since for the other brother, Levi Yehuda, Rachel now becomes Asur also because of Eishes Ach. So we say, Itois of Isur Legaba Didei. Shimon also becomes Asur to Rachel because of Eishes Ach. That works. That will explain it. And we'll see later that can be a perfect explanation. Because who said Rabbi Yossi argued in both cases? So if you remember in Daf Lamed Beis, there were two braises where Rabbi Shimon gave an opinion. But one could say that where Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon were quoted together, that would only be speaking about the case where Nasa Chai first. Okay, but we're not saying this right now. The challenge is, Aval Heichad Nasa Meis. But in the case where Reuven married first, Reuven marries Rachel. When Reuven marries Rachel, Rachel is usher to Shimon because of Eishes Ach. When Shimon marries Leah, Rachel doesn't become more usher to anyone. Was the Chaticha Asura is not being expanded, but there's Isur Koilol. What's the Isur Koilol? That, let's read it inside, V'achakach Nasachai. Ma Ikar Moisav, there's no Isur Moisav. Rachel doesn't become asur on other people. Elamai, you're going to answer, V'chitema, Migu di itasar bekulu achvasa. That when Shimon marries Leah, the other sister, Bila, Zilpa, they become asur on Shimon because of Achais Ishtoi. So therefore we should say that Rachel also becomes asur as Achais Ishtoi. So the Gemara says, no, Ha Yisur Koilolhu. And Rabbi Yossi does not hold by Isur Koilol that Isur Halal Isur. How do we know that? Now it's important to speak out to Tosfos because the Gemara in Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph is going to have an opinion that's going to hold that Rabbi Yossi, even by Isur Koilol, holds that Isur Halal Isur, which will be an answer. So obviously the proof that Tosfos gives cannot be a full-fledged proof, because not it's going to be a kash.
What is Tosfos?
The Gemara doesn't. The Gemara is giving it as for granted. The kasha against Rabbi Bohu that true Rabbi Yossi holds by Isur Moisav, Isur Halal Isur, but not by Isur Koilol. How do we know that? So Tosfos says, and again, what Tosfos says has to already be given in a way that you can slug it up. Because the Gemara later is going to hold that Rabbi Yossi holds that even by Isur Koilol, Isur Halal Isur. From the Braisa at the end of Daf Lamed Beis Amud Aleph. What's the case over there? A woman is married. She's a Eishes Ish. If Rabbi Yossi would hold that by Isur Koilol, Isur Halal Isur, if the man marries her daughter, what comes later? Chamaisa. So we said, Ein Isur Halal Isur. No, Nishtemes. True, the woman herself was asur on the son-in-law anyway, because she's a married woman. However, once a married marries, once there's Isur Chamaisa, once this person marries her daughter, now a man cannot marry the mother-in-law's mother. There are other women that become asur on him, beginning from Chamaisa. And if you hold that Rabbi Yossi holds that even by Isur Koilol, Isur Halal Isur, why did Rabbi Yossi say that you have to see which one came first and you only chayv one misa? You don't have to look for the chamura. It's Nishtemes. They're both Isurim should be chal. In the case of Eishes is first, then Chamoisa second. True, the Chaticha Surah, there's no Isur Moisav, but there's Isur Koilol. Because when you marry the daughter, so Chamoisa is irrelevant, but other women become Asur. Because forget about a married woman. When a man marries his wife, that does not allow him to be with the mother-in-law. It also does not allow him to be with the mother-in-law's relatives. So that's the raya, the given, that Rabbi Yossi by Isur Koilol holds Ein Isur Halal Isur. The counter to that is very good. The Isur of Chamoisa only goes to her. A man is not allowed to marry his mother-in-law's mother. That's called a Shem Acher. That's another name. That's the mother-in-law's mother. It's not the Isur of the mother-in-law. The example that we're giving here of Isur Koilol was that Reuven married Rachel. Rachel is Asur on all the brothers already, including on Shimon. When Shimon marries Leah, Achais Ish, she's Asur. She doesn't become more Asur. But the Isur of Achais Ishtoi goes to Bila. So we're saying Isur Koilol, since Achais Ishtoi, that Achais Ishtoi goes to Bila, Achais Ishtoi should also go to Rachel. That will be Isur Koilol. There we're using the same Isur. By the case of the mother-in-law and the Eishes Ish, the Isur Koilol, true, something else is being added, but the Chamoisa is not being added. There's only one mother-in-law. The mother-in-law's mother is someone else. That would be a counter and Taka, the Gemara doesn't talk this out, but later in Daf Lamed Gimel, we'll see that people held that Rabbi Yossi holds Sai by Isur Moisav and by Isur Kailol, that Isur is Halal Isur. But right now, Rabbi Bo gave an answer. Rabbi Bo is standing his ground that Rabbi Yossi holds Isur Halal Isur by Isur Moisav. And the Gemara counters, it doesn't explain both prices. To which Rava responds, Elo Amar Rava, really Rabbi Yossi holds Halt Kap Chevre Ein Isur Halal Isur. Period. Not by Isur Moisev, certainly not by Isur Koilel. So now the only question is, the first Brais on the Lamed Aleph, Lamed Beis on the top, where Rabbi Yossi says that if Shimon has a relation with Rachel, he's Chayiv Shtayim. Why Chayiv Shtayim? Ein Isur Halal Isur. It says Rabbi Yossi did not speak about a case where a man did something b'shoigeg, for which he has to bring two chata'os. You don't bring two karbanos. Ein Isur Halal Isur. Just like Rab Shimon, whichever one came first is the only Isur. There we're speaking about a man who had a relation b'mezid. And we're not speaking about punishment. Sometimes we need to know how many sins did the person violate, not to get punished. Mala ani olav ki ilo asa shtayim. When it comes to punishment, we have the rule ein isur halal isur. And using the words of Rav Ashi before, that even when it's not chal, it doesn't go away. It's there. So when you want to analyze not through the lenses of punishment and reward, but through how many violations did the person do? And we'll see soon Lamai Nafkamina in halacha, even if you hold ein isur halal isur, there is still that tali, it's still hanging in the air, and this person violated that also. He won't get punished for it, but he violated two sins. He married his brother, he had a relation with his brother's wife, he had a relation with his wife's sister. But the ein chayv ala achas. And the chen ki yasar Rav and Rabbi Yechanan. So we have both Rava and Rabbi Yechanan, both saying that Rabbi Yossi holds ein isur halal isur, not even when there is a kailul, not even when there is a moisef, according to Rav and Rabbi Yechanan. There he meant something else. That malani olav, it's as if he kilo asav ein chayv ala achas. And the Gemara just wants to know, well, if we're not speaking about punishment and reward, so give me a practical nafkamina that he's chayiv too. He violated two isurim. So the Gemara gives an interesting statement. So he says, "My nafkamina lo kavrei bein rishoim gemurim." In Masechta Sanhedrin, we learned over there the following in Daf Memvav, that if a person, after the people were killed by the Beis Din, they were buried in a special place in the cemetery for the Shoim. However, in that cemetery for the people that got killed by a Beis Din because they violated the capital punishment, it wasn't everyone in the same place. There, they also made two groups, two chelkas. There was the place for people who got killed either with Sreif and Skila, for the more serious sinners, and they had others that were buried that they only got hereg or chenek, the less sins. So here, according to the way Rashi learns, there's a machlekes rishonim how we learn it. Rashi says that such a person, if he were to die, you know where he would be buried. People weren't only buried there if they were killed by the Beis Din. Here, not eishes ach, nor achais ishtoi is a capital punishment. It's a kares. But if the person dies, you would bury him, you know where? With the Rishaim Gemurim. If there would only be one sin over here, then you would bury such a person together with the people that were killed, either through hereg or through chenek. The reason why Rabbi Yossi says he's chayiv shtayim, not to punish him, any isur halal isur, but being that there is two isurim, the one isur is hanging in the air, this person, if he dies, will be buried in the part of the Rishaim Gemurim. Okay. Novelty, a chiddush, but now recapping. Look at this. According to Rabbi Bohu, Rabbi Yossi holds that isur chal an isur by isur moisef, not by koilel, the way Tosfos explained, which is why he didn't respond, but by isur moisef, yes. According to Rav and according to Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Yossi will hold ein isur chal al isur, not even by isur moisef, certainly not an isur koilel. So the Gemara says ubeplukta, but you should know that this is up to a debate, and this is going to take a full daf. And it's very gishmak, that the Gemara is going to show you that there were other people that held, that Rabbi Yossi held, that Isur is chal on Isur, by Isur Maisav, even by Isur Koil. And according to them, you understand, the answer is going to be a lot better, that the Braisa that speaks about Rabbi Yossi says Chayiv Shtayim, Rabbi Yossi takement, Yechayiv tu karban chatois. Because Isur is chal al Isur, because it's Koilu and Moisef, depending who was the one who married first. How did we see that people held what Rabbi Yossi held regarding Isur Halal Isur? So now we go into this whole discussion, the Itmer. Now we're going to learn about 3 cases that share a common thread. They're very simple cases, but now we're getting off the laws of Yevamos. Now we're going to other dinim. Din case number 1, Zor Sheshimish B'Shabbos. We learned together that whenever Hashem said the words Bimoi Adoi, when it comes to Karbanis, whenever a sacrifice needs to be brought on a specific date, so even if that date is Shabbos or Yontif, and even though during the offerings of Karbanis many Do'iraisas are broken, but the din will be that this overrules the Shabbos. So a Karban Tamid, a Karban Musaf, will be brought in the third Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos and on Yontif. What happens if a non-Kohen, a Zar, was the one that did the Avodah? At the end of the Sugya, the Gemara is going to get into the technical questions. Exactly what did he do? Don't forget, Shchitas Ksher B'Zar. Receiving the blood, which is an Avodah, is not breaking Shabbos, it's certainly not Midoraisa. But we'll find a case where a Zar did something, which is a blatant Doiraisa Dika violation. The question is this Zar Chayiv Achas or Shtayim? In other words, there's a prohibition for a Zar to work in the Beis HaMikdash, a non-Kohen, a foreigner. There's another prohibition for one to break Shabbos. So here there's going to be a machlek.
If the Kohen done it, there would
be no violation. The question is, now that the Zar did it, is he Chayiv 1 or Chayiv 2? Let's read it inside. So Rab Chia said Chayiv Shtayim. Bar Kapara says he's only Chayiv 1. Kofatz Rab Chia. Rab Chia jumped, V'nishma, and he swore. This will be very important later in Daf Lamed Gimel. And he says, Ha-Avodah, by the service of the Beis HaMikdash. That's a Lashon Shvua. Kach shamaiti mi Rebbe, I heard from Rebbe, from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Shtayim. Yeah? So Bar Kapara wasn't intimidated. So Kopfatz, Bar Kapara v'nishba. Bar Kapara jumps and he swears, Ha-Avodah, Kach shamaiti mi Rebbe, I heard from Rebbe, that Achas. So each one, and we're going to have to see later, none of them were lying. Each one believed what the other one said, but they need to explain the mistake. And the Gemara is going to talk it out beautifully, all sides. You know, Rab Chia agreed that Rebbe told Kapara Achas, but Rab Chia chapped that when Rebbe was telling Bar Kapara Achas, he was speaking, let's say, according to Rab Shimon, not according to Rabbi Yossi. We'll work this out in a moment. Each one has to figure out how the other one can be saying the truth, but they're wrong anyway. And his Chol Rab Chia Ladun, and Rab Chia began to argue with Bar Kapara. And he tells him like this, Shabbos la koil nesra. Shabbos, when Hashem says you can't break Shabbos, it's to Kahanim, it's to non-Kahanim. However, Kishuhutra b'Migdash, when Hashem allowed certain violations to happen in the Beis HaMikdash, it was only Eitzel Kahanim Mutra. It was only for the Kohen doing the Avodah. In other words, la Kahanim Mutra, v'loy l'zar. And therefore, Yesh Khan, both, he's a Zar, he's a non-Kohen during the Avodah, and also because of Chilul Shabbos. He's called Bar Kapara Ladon. Bar Kapara responded back, and he said, no, Shabbos la kol nes. Shabbos is for all the Jewish people. However, Kishuhutra b'Mikdash, but when God allowed certain things like the Karban Tamid, Karban Musaf, the Bimai Adoi Karbanis to be brought, is Hutra, it's prohibited, it's permitted. In other words, there is no Shabbos issue. Ein kan Elazarus. True, he is not a Kohen. He shouldn't have been doing the Avodah. But there's no Chilul Shabbos. Case number 2. Same logic. A Balmum that served in the Beis HaMikdash while he was Tamei. We know that by the Karbanos, again, that need to be brought in a specific time, that cannot be brought later as well. Let's go back to Tamid. Like Karban Pesach, it has to be brought the 14th after Chatzos. In the Beis HaMikdash, the rule is that if either Roiv of the Jewish people are Tamei, or if we're speaking about Kahanim during Avodah, if Roiv of the Kahanim, if the majority of the Kahanim are Tamei, so Tuma is either Hutra or Tchuya. It's not relevant, that detail right now. Then the Avodah could be done with Tuma. However, a Balmum, a Kohen who has one of the blemishes that disqualify him from doing the service, cannot do any Avodah. So what happens if a Balmum did the service Betumah? Same thing. Rabbi Yossi says, Chayiv Shtayim.
But is this a case where everybody's
Roiv Kahanim are Tamei? Yeah. Exactly.
So the tummy issue is not really.
Well, that's the argument. You can argue that when did a God allow something to happen betuma? Only if a kosher kohen is doing it. Same thing. Bar Kapara says he's only chayiv one. And the same thing. Rab Chia jumps and he swears, I swear by the temple service. Here we're speaking about temple service. That I heard from my teacher Rebbe Stein that you chayiv twice. And again, Rab Chia began to argue and he said the following. No one can go into the Beis HaMikdash, no one can do Avodah when there are tamei. However, Kishuhutra B'Mikdash, when there was this exception, that if the majority of people, or if all of the people, or if the majority or all of the Kahanim are Tamei, then they are allowed to do the service. That was only Eitzel Kahanim Tamimim Hutra. That was only for Kahanim that are allowed to do the Avodah. However, the Kahanim Tamimim Hutra v'leila Balimumim. And therefore, Yeshkan, both because of Balmum, that everyone agrees to, on top of that argues Rab Chia, he's also violating the prohibition of serving Betuma. And in reverse, his Chil Bal Kapara Ladun, Bar Kapara is going to go and say the opposite. And by the way, over here, we're not speaking about a Chiyuv Chatas, because Zor, that does the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, b'mezid, is not Chayiv Kares. When does a person have to bring a Chatos when they did something b'shoigeg for a sin, that if that would have been done on purpose, there would be at least a Kares punishment. Here, Zor, a non-Kohen that does Avodah is only Chayiv Misa B'dei Shamayim. So it doesn't matter here about exactly what punishment would happen. Point is, there were two lavim violated. There were two isurim violated. But Kapara says no, that tuma lakol nesra. However, kishu hutra b'migdrash hutra, period. Whenever there's a dispensation for tuma, which is like you mentioned, when the majority of the kahanim are tamei, so Hashem is allowing at this moment people to do the avodah even betuma. It's mutter for everyone. Ein kanel mishum balmum. So that's the second case. So we had zor b'Shabbos. Second case is balmum betuma, and here comes the third case. Zor sha'achal milika. Milika is the special way that a bird korban was geshachten, was slaughtered in the Beis HaMikdash. It was not done the way shechita needs to be done regularly, but the kohen would take his thumb-pointed fingernail, he would insert it on the backside, in the oiref of the bird's neck. V'lo yavdil, we'll learn all these details, God willing, in Kachim. And there's two types of bird karbanis. There is an oilas ha'oif, which is fully burnt on the mizbeach, and then you have a chatos ha'oif, which is eaten. Some of it is eaten by the kahanim. Now, if one were to do melika for a normal bird here outside the Beis HaMikdash, that bird would have the category of nevela, which if a person eats nevela, say b'mezid yechayv malchus. What happens if over here, Zor ate the chatas ha'oif? Now we're going to see later, by the way, that me'ilah is only on parts of a korban that kahanim cannot eat. The moment kahanim can eat the korban, in other words, after shechita was done, there's no me'ilah, but the question is, how many lavim, how many violations did he do? Rab Chia says he's chayiv two. Bar Kapara says it's only chayiv one. And the same thing, Kafetz Rab Chia v'nishba ho avodah, kach shamati mi Rebbe Shtayim, Rebbe told me to. Kafetz Bar Kapara v'nishba ho avodah, I swear by the temple service, I heard from my teacher Rebbe Achas. And he's Chol Rab Chia Lodon. Rab Chia began to argue the same logic, nevela lakoil nesra. God does not allow any Jew ever to eat nevela. However, Kishuhutra b'Mikdash, when Hashem allowed Melika to happen in the Beis HaMikdash, meaning that Melika does what Shechita does, that's only Eitzel Kahanim Hutra. You have a machlekes in Achrayim, exactly what does Melika do to the Kohen? Is it that God allows the Kohen to eat Nevela? Or is it that Melika is like Shechita? But whatever it is, that heter of Melika is only for Kahanim. Like Kahanim Hutra v'leila Zorim. So not only you see a Zor who's eating kachim, which is one violation, you also have a Yid eating nevela. Yesh kan mishum melika, which is nevela. He's chol ba kapara ladon. Kapara argued, no, nevela lakol nesra. However, Kishuhutra B'Mikdash, but when Hashem said that in the Beis HaMikdash, when you slaughter a bird, it's done through the process called Milika, then Hutra, then that animal is not called Nevela. And therefore, the only violation here is Ve'en Kan Ela Mishum Zorus. The only violation here is that he's a non-kohen eating a chatos ha'oif. Okay, so let's just start on top of Daf Lamed Gimel. So the Gemara says, "B'mai komifligi." What are they arguing in? And look inside the Tosfos Yeshanim here in the Shas Vilna. It's all the way on the left, on the top. B'mai komifligi. I mean, come on. What do you mean? The Gemara said b'mai komifligi. The Gemara was telling you what Rab Chia told Bar Kapara, what Kapara told Rab Chia. So the Tosfos says that the Mai Ka'amar Kishuhutru ain't the Iker Tam. That even though they were telling each other reasons, that cannot be the main reason, because the Ha'efsher Loimim B'Shnei Tzedadim. Because each side has a validity. So there has to be some type of underlying essential argument, which is the cause for Rab Chia and Bar Kapara to argue in all these three cases. Why is it Shtayim according to Rab Chia? Why is it Achaz according to Bar Kapara? We'll stop over here.